6:30 in the morning, June 6th, 1944. The English Channel is on fire. Thousands of landing craft cut through gray water toward the beaches of Normandy. Overhead, aircraft engines drown out the sound of the surf. Below deck, young men grip their rifles and wait for the ramps to drop. Some of them will not live to see the sand. This is the invasion, the one that will decide the war. But 80 miles to the northeast, inside a German command post, officers are hunched over maps of a different coastline entirely. They are not looking at Normandy, they are looking at Calais. Because as far as German intelligence is concerned, Normandy isn't the invasion. It's a decoy, a feint, a trick to pull their reserves out of position before the real attack lands where it was always supposed to land, at the narrowest point of the channel, delivered by the most feared American general in Europe. They are waiting for Patton. Waiting for an army of over 1 million men, sitting in southeastern England, ready to cross 21 miles of water and smash into the coast the Germans have spent 4 years fortifying. There's just one problem. That army doesn't exist. Not the way Germany thinks it does, not as a fighting force capable of crossing the channel. Most of it is paper. Radio signals, rumors passed along by spies who were never actually spies at all. And yet, on the single most important morning of the entire war, an enormous portion of the German military, one of their most powerful field armies, is standing still, waiting, watching an empty stretch of ocean for soldiers who will never arrive. How does that happen? How does one of the most sophisticated intelligence services in the world convince itself that an army of 1 million men is real when it isn't? It's not a story about inflatable tanks. It's something far stranger. And to understand it, we have to go back several months, to the moment the Allies realized that beating Germany on the beaches wouldn't be enough. They also had to beat Germany's mind. By early 1944, nobody in Berlin doubted that an invasion was coming. Allied troops, ships, and aircraft were massing across southern England in numbers too large to hide. The question German commanders were asking wasn't if, it was where. And geography gave them a very confident answer. Pas-de-Calais sits at the narrowest point of the English Channel, just over 20 miles from the English coast. It offered the shortest crossing, the fastest resupply lines, and the most direct route into Germany's industrial heartland. To any professional military planner studying a map, Calais wasn't just a plausible target, it was the obvious one. Understood this too, and they made a decision that would shape the entire deception. Instead of fighting that assumption, they would feed it. If Germany was already primed to believe the real blow was coming at Calais, the Allies didn't need to invent a new lie from nothing. They only needed to make the existing one look real, which meant they needed the right face to put in front of it. Enter George S. Patton. By 1944, Patton was already a legend to friend and enemy alike, the aggressive, relentless tank commander who had torn through North Africa and Sicily. German intelligence officers, particularly the analysts at Fremde Heer West, respected him as the sharpest armored commander the Allies had. To their thinking, there was simply no version of the main invasion that didn't include him. German intelligence did not know, what almost no one outside a small circle in London knew, was that Patton was, at that exact moment, in disgrace. Months earlier in Sicily, Patton had struck 2 shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals. The scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower sidelined him, pulled him out of frontline command, and left his future in the war deeply uncertain. But someone in Allied intelligence looked at a disgraced general sitting idle in England and saw an opportunity instead of a liability. If Patton wasn't leading the real invasion, why not let the Germans believe he was leading a different one? So the Allies did something almost audacious in its simplicity. They let Patton be seen, publicly, reviewing troops, traveling between bases, behaving in every visible way like a general preparing his soldiers for the largest operation of his career. German agents watched him, German intelligence tracked his movements, and slowly a picture began to form in Berlin, a picture of Patton in England commanding something enormous. Something called the First United States Army Group. FUSAG had actually existed before any of this, a real planning headquarters, formed in London the year before, originally commanded by General Omar Bradley. But by the spring of 1944, its true purpose had shifted entirely. The real fighting formations, once loosely tied to it, had been reassigned elsewhere. What remained was a name, a headquarters, an empty shell. And into that shell, Allied planners began pouring an entire fictional army. On German maps, FUSAG grew to more than 50 divisions. Real formations, like the U.S. Third Army, were folded into its order of battle, quietly kept out of Normandy so they could still be seen preparing for Calais. Alongside them sat armies that had never existed at all. Entire corps, entire divisions, built from nothing but shoulder patches, unit histories, and paperwork designed for one purpose only: to be discovered. Because here is the part that should unsettle you. An inflatable tank might fool a single photograph, but a photograph on its own doesn't win the trust of an intelligence service. Photographs get questioned, cross-checked, compared against other sources. Something else had to make the lie believable, something bigger than props, something that could survive scrutiny from multiple directions at once, because in the spring of 1944, that's exactly what German intelligence was doing, cross-checking everything. Reconnaissance photographs of English camps, radio intercepts describing troop movements, and, most dangerously of all, reports from trusted agents inside Britain itself. Agents German intelligence had recruited, trained, and paid. Agents they believed were loyal. They were wrong about that, too. By the early summer of 1944, 3 separate streams of evidence were flowing into Berlin: visual, electronic, and human, and every one of them was quietly pointing toward the exact same conclusion. An American army group was massing in southeastern England. Patton was preparing to lead it, and the real target was Calais. The tanks in those English fields were canvas and scaffolding. The camps were half built and half lit. The divisions on German maps didn't have a single soldier standing in formation anywhere. But the radio traffic was real. The photographs were real. Somewhere inside a heavily guarded intelligence building outside Berlin, analysts were assembling those pieces into something that felt, to them, like undeniable proof. Proof of an army that was about to cross the Channel. Proof that would convince Adolf Hitler himself to hold back the very forces that might have changed everything on the beaches of Normandy. Because the truth is, nobody had simply lied to German intelligence. Somebody had built them a machine designed to lie to them, from every direction, all at once. How they built the lie. To understand how German intelligence was fooled, you have to stop thinking of the deception as a single lie. It wasn't one lie. It was a system, and like any system, it had been built piece by piece, each part designed to support the one next to it. The fake army needed equipment. That equipment needed somewhere to sit. Somewhere to sit meant camps, and camps meant movement, trucks, supply runs, the ordinary chaos of a real military base. Movement meant communication, and communication meant radio traffic that had to sound in every detail like the real thing. But radio traffic alone still wasn't enough. Even convincing signals could be dismissed as isolated, unconfirmed, unreliable. What the deception needed, what would make it unbreakable, was corroboration. A second independent source telling German intelligence exactly what the radios were already telling them. That's where the spies came in. All of this sat beneath a much larger Allied strategy called Operation Bodyguard, a sprawling, continent-wide deception campaign meant to hide the timing, scale, and location of the invasion from every angle. Beneath Bodyguard sat Operation Fortitude, focused specifically on protecting the Normandy landings. And beneath Fortitude sat two regional operations, one convincing Germany that Norway was under threat, and another, Fortitude South, built around the lie unfolding in Kent and Sussex. FUSAG was the centerpiece of Fortitude South, but FUSAG alone was just a name and a scattering of dummy equipment. It needed a voice. That voice came from a British program most people have never heard of, the double-cross system. In 1944, British intelligence had achieved something almost unbelievable. Every single German spy operating in Britain had either been captured and turned or had walked in willingly to work for the other side from the very beginning. Which meant that everything German intelligence believed about Britain, every report reaching Berlin from inside enemy territory, was actually being written by the people it was meant to deceive. One of those agents mattered more than any other. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia. German intelligence knew him by a different name entirely, believing him to be one of their most valuable operatives in Britain. The British called him something else. Garbo. He wasn't a trained spy. He was a Spanish civilian who despised fascism and had talked his way into German intelligence years earlier, using nothing but invented reports and a gift for detail. By 1944, working now for the British, he had built something extraordinary, an entire fictional spy network. 27 subagents, each with a name, a job, a personality, none of whom existed. Garbo used that network to feed Germany a steady stream of reports about troop concentrations in southeastern England, shoulder patches spotted in pubs, convoys on country roads, fragments of overheard conversation. Small, mundane, believable details, the kind no propagandist would think to invent, but exactly the kind a real spy would notice. Dangerous. Everything he'd told the Germans before this had turned out to be true. Because British intelligence had been feeding him accurate information all along, information that was true but harmless. By the time it mattered, Garbo didn't need to convince the Germans he was trustworthy. They already believed it completely. Meanwhile, above all of it, a quieter kind of deception filled the airwaves. Operation Quicksilver, the radio half of Fortitude South. Allied signal units didn't broadcast dramatic messages about an invasion. They broadcast something far more convincing: boredom. For spare truck parts, complaints about rations, routine coordination between fictional units moving through real English roads. Elite signalmen even studied the individual transmitting habits of known operators, their rhythm, their timing, and copied them precisely, so German listeners would recognize familiar voices on the air. German signals intelligence intercepted all of it. And because the encryption was sometimes left just weak enough to crack, German analysts felt they had earned this information themselves, which made them trust it even more than if it had simply been handed to them. Now picture the German intelligence officer receiving all of this at once. A spy report describing a fictional American army. A radio intercept the very next day referencing that exact same unit. Reconnaissance photographs days later showing landing craft massed exactly where the reports said they'd be. Separate sources, 3 independent confirmations, all pointing at the same lie. To an analyst trained to distrust single sources and value cross-verification, this wasn't propaganda, this was proof. By late spring, the illusion had grown large enough that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, pointed to Patton's continued presence in England as confirmation that Normandy could not be the main event. Germany's best tank commander, he reasoned, would never be left out of the decisive battle. At Fremde Heere West, the department responsible for assessing Allied strength, Colonel Baron Alexis von Rona accepted FUSAG's fictional order of battle almost entirely, passing reports up the chain suggesting Germany faced 60 or more Allied divisions in Britain, nearly double the true number. Historians still argue about Rona. He was secretly opposed to Hitler and would later be executed for his role in the July plot against him. Was he simply fooled, like everyone around him? Or did he see an opportunity to inflate the threat and keep Hitler cautious? We may never know for certain, but the effect was the same either way. The lie moved upward, from spies to signals to generals to Hitler himself. Then came June 6th. Here is the revelation that changes everything about this story. Fortitude wasn't designed only to work before the invasion. It was built to keep working after it. The planners behind this deception understood something brutal about their own plan. Fooling Germany for a few weeks before D-Day wouldn't be enough. The real danger wasn't the initial landing. It was the days and weeks that followed, while Allied forces were still fragile, still fighting to hold a narrow strip of French coastline, still vulnerable to a concentrated German counterattack. If the 18 or so divisions of the German 15th Army, sitting idle around Calais, ever moved south toward Normandy in force, the invasion could collapse. So the lie couldn't end on June 6th. It had to survive it. As Allied troops fought their way off the beaches, Garbo kept transmitting. Quicksilver's radios kept broadcasting fictional supply requests, and in German headquarters, commanders kept receiving the same message over and over from every direction they trusted. Normandy is not the real invasion. Rommel, rushing back from Germany, wanted the panzer reserves released immediately. Rundstedt requested the same. Hitler refused. Not out of stubbornness, out of belief in an army that didn't exist. And as the days pass, that belief is about to be tested in the most direct way possible, by a message so convincing, delivered at exactly the right moment, that it will freeze one of Germany's most powerful divisions in place, while Allied soldiers fight for their lives less than 200 miles away. That message is coming, and it's about to become the most consequential lie of the entire war. Part 3. The Army That Never Came. June 9th, 1944, 3 days after Normandy. At his headquarters, Hitler receives a message from a source he has trusted for years, the same network that has fed him accurate, verified intelligence again and again. The message is simple. It is a diversion. The real invasion is still coming, at Calais. It is signed by Garbo. Hitler reads it, and he makes his decision. The 1st SS Panzer Division, already moving toward Normandy, is ordered to halt. The 15th Army stays exactly where it is. Reserves that might have crushed the fragile Allied beachhead remain locked in place, guarding a coastline no one is coming to attack. This is the climax of the entire deception. Not a battle, a single message, believed at exactly the right moment. But here's what makes it remarkable. Garbo had actually tried to warn the Germans about Normandy hours before the landings began, a transmission sent at 3 in the morning on June 6th. It was true, and it was useless, timed deliberately so his handlers wouldn't receive it until it was already too late to act. That single, harmless truth is what made everything he said afterward unquestionable. Through June and into July, the machine keeps running. Radio traffic continues. Reports of troops boarding ships in the Thames keep arriving in Berlin. When Patton finally leaves for France in July to take real command of the Third Army, the illusion doesn't collapse, it adapts. General Leslie McNair is quietly installed as FUSAG's new commander, and the story shifts. Patton's departure is just the vanguard. The main force is still coming. Weeks later, McNair is killed by American bombs in a friendly fire accident in Normandy, a tragedy that briefly threatens to expose the entire fiction. The Allies move fast, installing another commander, and the lie holds. For 7 weeks after D-Day, the German 15th Army stays at Calais, hundreds of thousands of men, watching an empty ocean. 7 weeks Germany never gets back. By August, as Allied forces finally break out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The American army that never arrived never was going to arrive. The 15th Army begins moving south, far too late to change what has already happened. So, was Fortitude the reason the Allies won? Historians don't fully agree. Some argue it was decisive, a masterstroke that single-handedly paralyzed Germany's strongest reserves. Others point out that Allied air power had already crippled French rail lines and that German command failures played their own part. The honest answer sits somewhere between those two views. Fortitude didn't win the war by itself, but it bought something that couldn't be replaced: time. And as for the men who built it, Patton returned to the battlefield as one of the most effective commanders in Europe. His reputation, once damaged, fully restored by the same campaign he'd helped deceive an enemy into fearing. Garbo received medals from both sides of the war he'd helped decide, then quietly vanished into a new life, his real story hidden for decades. Von Rona, the German officer who accepted the lie completely, was executed months later for his role in the plot against Hitler, leaving behind a question historians still can't fully answer. Did he believe the deception, or did he help it succeed? So, how did Germany see an army that wasn't there? Not because of one convincing trick, because dozens of small, ordinary pieces of evidence, a radio signal, a spy's note, a photograph, a general's reputation, all seemed to confirm each other at once. That was the real weapon. Not deception, confirmation. The Allies didn't defeat Germany by making the enemy see nothing. They defeated Germany by making the enemy see exactly what it expected to see and trust it completely. Somewhere along a quiet stretch of French coastline, 200 miles from Calais, that trust cost Germany the war.